Wake up, everybody. Welcome into Redacted on this Thursday. I'm Clayton Morris.
I'm Natalie Morris.
And on this show, we cover the stories the mainstream media largely ignores. Of course, they largely ignored everything related to the Russian collusion hoax. And now there is a groundswell effort to have Hillary Clinton arrested. New bombshell revelations being dropped today from Senator Grassley's office around her direct involvement and approval in the Russian collusion hoax. We're going to show you the documents. And does this rise to the level of her being arrested and maybe serving the rest of her days behind prison walls?
I'm going to tell you, this is the biggest smoking gun we have seen. Even if you know the Russiagate collusion, it's amazing to see this in writing. I'm shocked by it, so stick around for that.
Maybe she could be cellmates with Ghislaine.
There we go. Two peas in a pod.
One of them will get out, yeah.
All right. We're also going to talk about how many people have died in the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, because that is exceedingly hard to pin down. Clearly, they're lying to us. We're going to talk to Colonel McGregor about that.
Yeah, we're also going to talk about this crazy deal that Trump just did with the EU. Many are saying, how in the world did the EU totally bend the knee to President Trump? There's like nothing beneficial to the EU in this whole tariff trade deal that President Trump just laid out. This seems like a huge middle finger to the European Union. What is going on here with this? We're going to dive deep into that and so much more. And by the way, how did Canada suddenly become really an anti-Christian country? We're going to talk about all of that and more on the show today, but we don't want to waste any more time. We want to get right to what's going on with the wars and an update here. It's time to get an assessment of the war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza. How many people have died? From a military perspective, what's next in Russia? Like, we talk about 30,000 foot level discussions about these wars, but militarily, like on the ground, what is next? And what's next for Israel in their Greater Israel Land Grab project, which, of course, has been rolled out since 1948. During yesterday's interview with Professor John Mearsheimer, Tucker Carlson sort of echoed our frustration here at Redacted when he asked this question about the number of dead Ukrainians and Palestinians. Watch.
It's weird that in 2025, we can measure everything from your heart rate to sunspots, that we don't know how many people were killed in Russia, Ukraine, or Palestine. We can't even get, I've never met anyone who can give me a hard number on Russian casualties, Ukrainian casualties, or dead Palestinians in Gaza. That's weird.
Yeah, it's weird. Yesterday, we reported how Ukraine is now allowing grandfathers to fight in the war. Zelensky signed a law allowing citizens over 60 to join the military during wartime. Recruiting over 60-year-olds, a clear sign the Ukrainian army has been decimated. Colonel Douglas McGregor has warned us for years that the U.S. is backing the wrong wars, losing credibility by the day. Let's take a look at the scoreboard in Ukraine and Israel, where our tax dollars are being funneled right now. In Ukraine, the much-hyped counteroffensive failed. NATO is fracturing. Many people calling for it to be disbanded. Now, with President Trump's 10-day deadline looming over Russia, Kiev is scraping the bottom of the barrel right now, drafting men in their 60s. Russia isn't retreating. They're advancing. So why would they blink at all with this 10-day threat from Trump? Meanwhile, in Gaza, we're watching the unthinkable become routine. Ralph Nader, remember Ralph Nader, former presidential candidate, says the death toll is approaching 500,000. And now Israel has moved to annex the so-called buffer zone, land that was once Palestinian. This isn't defense. This is conquest. So what are we really witnessing here? Two wars, both sold to the public as moral crusades, but both spiraling into something far darker. Colonel Douglas McGregor is here to help make sense of all of this. Colonel, good to see you. I just want to, I really wanted to get an assessment of where we were in both of these conflicts right now. Is there an end game here? And do you think you have a hard and fast number on Ukraine? Let's start with Ukraine first before we get to Gaza. How many Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in this? Do you have close to a hard number of that in this war?
You're muted, sir.
Oh, you're muted.
I have a visitor right now, and she's interfering with things. She's a new arrival.
So cute.
What I was going to say is that, my sources that are on the ground, largely in Poland, to a lesser extent in Ukraine and inside Russia, They tell me 1.8 million dead is a good number for the numbers of Ukrainian soldiers who've been killed. And if you look at that number, you've got to also assume that there are at least as many wounded, probably more. And most of those wounded will never return to duty. In other words, they're so severe that they're permanently invalids. They can't contribute anymore, which explains why they're now scraping the bottom of the barrel, literally, by bringing in 60-year-old, 65-year-old men. It's a catastrophe. Now, why is this the case? Because for the last, I would say, 6 months easily, the Ukrainian military, particularly its army, but the military in general, has been failing badly against the Russians. And they are in a state very similar to the German army as it disintegrated at the end of the Second World War. If you go back to 1944 and 45, most of the heavy casualties that the Germans took came in the last 6 to 9 months of the war. That's when things are falling apart, and you have large numbers of people who are trying to disengage, retire to new positions, or simply fall back to what they hope will be safety. And as that happens, you're seeing all the things that are being broadcast on your screen now fall on them by the thousands. I think last night it was 700 plus drones in Kiev. I don't know how many missiles and rocket artillery, but you're talking about a world in which there is no rest, a world in which there is no hiding, there is no peace, there's no concealment. And so 1.8 million is, I think, very accurate. Now, some people insist they're more dead than that. That may well be the case, but certainly not less.
1.8 million. I mean, I just dwell on that for a second, because what the Ukrainian numbers are, right? Like, Ukraine has told us like maybe 200,000 if we're lucky. I mean,
well, Clayton, Natalie, we've been dealing with this narrative that's just based on lies created by MI6 in London and CIA in Langley. They, of course, are joined at the hip with the Mossad. So you're talking about this large intelligence complex that has a media that's willing to cooperate. So what you hear in the mainstream media, of course, are also lies, because that media is supportive of these policies. So when you look at the Wall Street banks and their owners, the private equity gurus, the oligarchs that have billions, plus the media and Hollywood, obviously, you put those together, and now you have the intelligence apparatus, which is penetrated and full of what we used to call neocons. I don't know what you call them now, globalist maniacs. I have no idea, but they are 100% behind what's happening. And you have a Congress, and I would say on average, they all have a cocktail level of familiarity with
America is back, thanks to President.
So they actually believe whatever they're reading in the mainstream media, and they believe whatever the assessments they're shown from the CIA and others. So the truth is dead. The only place you get the truth is to go to alternate media. Again, as I said before, people like you out there are actually searching for and finding the truth. But most people just repeat whatever the narrative is that comes down through the sources I just named.
Now, what about Russia's military strategy? Because they are not losing. They are not being pushed back along the battlefront. And in fact, when you look at the maps, it shows that Ukrainian troops are not even there to push back. They're centered along the border with Russia, not in the contested region. So why would Russia respond to a threat from President Trump? And do you think Russia has any qualms now about going up against old men? I want to ask you, maybe you can ring in on this as well. You've had experience in the Pentagon. What would you do with elderly men in your ranks?
I would give them a chance to surrender, and I'm sure the Russians will. The Russians have not been as bloodthirsty and barbarous as claimed. They've actually been very receptive to people on the Ukrainian side that wanted to surrender, and the Ukrainians that have surrendered have all reported that they've been treated well, they've been well fed, cared for. In most cases, I was reading a transcript of a radio transmission recently where a Ukrainian officer in command of what was left of his company, which was very small, decided to surrender to the Russians because he said, there's no way the injured men that have survived with me are going to be cared for by the Ukrainians. They have no medical infrastructure. They can't evacuate anybody. So when you go forward to the front, you fight there, and that's where you die. So under those circumstances, what are you going to do? They'll surrender. I'm sure they will, and the Russians will be happy to take it, because the more people that surrender, the fewer people you've got to fight. But I think it's important for us to understand that we have lied so prolifically for so long to the Russians, they don't believe anything we say anymore. And they certainly don't pay any attention to President Trump's threats. President Trump is like the weather. It depends on which way the wind is blowing, as what he's likely to say or not likely to say. And his threats, what are they? That they're going to add sanctions. And in order to add sanctions, you're threatening the rest of the world if it does business with Russia or business with China or somebody else. It's absurd. This is all going nowhere. And unfortunately, most Americans, they just turn on the television. They go, oh, well, he's a tough guy. That's right. Let's get those guys. They don't know what they're listening to. And they don't understand it. Because right now, I can tell you the Russians are prepared for World War III. They've said it, as far as they're concerned, it's already begun. We don't understand that a lot of these sanctions that we're talking about are the equivalent of warfare. You know, when you sanction countries, when you steal $300 billion of sovereign national wealth from the Russians on the assumption that you're somehow or another morally superior and can do whatever you want, you're effectively declaring war on the Russian state and its people. And that's where we are. We don't get it. Recently, I was talking to some people inside the Beltway. They said, well, you know, if this doesn't work, we'll have to use Tomahawks. What? Tomahawk missiles? What, have you lost your mind? You think the Russians are going to sit there and say, oh, well, look, that's a Tomahawk. Gosh, I guess these Americans are really upset. They're going to strike. First of all, they'll shoot them down. They're not supersonic. Well, some of them are, but they're not hypersonic. And they'll shoot them down, and then they'll respond. And if they're shot from Germany or shot from Poland or Lithuania, I would expect the Oreshniks to come in and obliterate the point from which they were launched. Is this what we want? I don't think so.
We have a comment here that says, didn't you used to be pro-Trump? We're not here to be pro any one person or administration. We're here to talk about the reality that we live in. So you very much could like President Trump and still not like how this is playing out in the battlefield. So people are confused by this lack of tribalism.
Well, Natalie, when I spoke to Trump privately, and this is back in November, and then in April and November of 2020, I was a very different man. This was a man who felt strongly that we should withdraw our forces from Europe. The Europeans should ultimately be their own first responders. I think he's 100% right. I thought so then. I still think so now. He absolutely rejected the notion that Russia or China posed an existential threat to us. When I argued that the real existential threat to the United States emanates from the Caribbean basin and Mexico and the drug cartels as a result of the human trafficking and drug trafficking, he agreed. That's 2020. And if you go back to when he ran for office this time around in 2024, most of what he said tracked with what he's always believed in the past. But he's gotten in there and he's done a 180-degree turn. He is clearly the hostage or captive or prisoner of the big lobbies, whether it's the Israel lobby or the war lobby or the pharmaceuticals or anything else. And I think that's where we are. And so under the circumstances, what am I supposed to do? Continue to say I love Donald Trump? Well, I like him personally, but I think he's leading us down the path to destruction now.
Yeah. You could be like these other conservative influencers who just want to do interviews with Trump administration officials so they kiss his ass and
or make excuses.
Yeah, and you know who they are. You know who I'm talking about. But we're not going to do that on this show, and because we don't have to answer to anybody, and we don't have any big backers financing us that we have to answer to that. So we're going to be critical and praise him when he does something great, and criticize him when he does something like this. So I want to turn, before we get you out of here, Colonel, on to Palestine, on to the genocide in Gaza. Ralph Nader, honestly, I haven't heard Ralph's name come up in a long time, but in an interview, he just posted this about that the death toll is approaching 500,000. Because I'm trying to get real numbers here. Again, in Tucker's discussion with John Mearsheimer, this seems to be the big frustration. And Ralph Nader says 500,000 dead in Gaza. John Mearsheimer yesterday saying it's hard to get an accurate number because so many of them are just buried under rubble from the onslaught from the Israelis. Do you have a number assessment that you know of from your sources?
I've seen some assessments that have ranged from 70,000 up to 450,000. And I'm sure that Professor Mearsheimer is right in the sense that there are lots of dead, unfortunately, about which we know nothing. And we can't go in there without teams to verify or conduct, investigations. That's not going to happen as long as the Israeli state exists. They're going to cover up or conceal whatever the truth is. They long since abandoned telling the truth about anything. So at this point, and I have a lot of respect, by the way, for Ralph Nader. I think he's a man of real integrity, character, and courage, even if I don't agree with him. Whenever you listen to Ralph Nader, he's telling you the truth that as he knows it, and he's trying to tell it in a way that makes sense. So I'm afraid that Ralph's number of 500,000 is plausible. But my sources, obviously, in Israel have dried up completely, because unless you are 100% with them, you're against them as far as they're concerned.
Right. As he points out in this radio interview, even Israeli reporters are not allowed to see the truth. They're not allowed. There was a BBC reporter this week who was flying over Gaza and was forbidden from filming out the window of the plane. Ralph Nader says, you have this tiny enclave the size of Philadelphia, 2.3 million people, and they're hit with everything you can think of: bombs, artillery, sniper fire, denial of food, water, infectious diseases, destroying homes and apartment buildings. And yet we're supposed to believe that most of them are still alive, that 97 out of every 100 Gazans are alive. He says, what are they made of? Steel and asbestos? No, they're flesh and blood. They're families like us. They're women and children and elderly and the likes. And so we can't get an assessment, but we have to remember that they're not superhuman like us. So how could we expect a population to survive this?
Well, you just brought up something that needs to be understood, and that is that as far as the Israelis are concerned, they are not us. They have nothing to do with us. In other words, these are subhumans, and they richly deserve to be exterminated. You can turn on the Knesset when it's broadcast or Israeli television, and Ben Gvir and others of his ilk will be happy to tell you that. So will Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, we need to understand something, that the elimination of the Palestinian population from both Gaza and the West Bank is ongoing. And we are, unfortunately, accomplices in this thing, which is pretty awful. And somebody said, well, we have a lot of people in this country that don't belong here and should be expelled. I said, well, of course. But the people you're talking about rounding up, these illegal aliens, this is not their country. They weren't born here. They have no connection to it. But the people that live in Gaza and the West Bank, well, their ancestors have been there for 2,000 years. They do have a right to live there. It's a vast difference between expelling illegal aliens and trying to expel Palestinians. But this is ongoing. It's not going to stop. And it's part of the larger process. You mentioned the Greater Israel Project. That's pressing ahead in Syria. And in order to secure Israeli control of southern Syria, they plan on annexing the areas that belong to the Druze that run along the border with Iraq and all the way up to Iran. And of course, they also have an area in northern Syria, Rojava, which is considered Kurdistan. And all of this borders Turkey. In the middle of this is this jihadist Sunni, Islamist state that's emerged under this man Jalani, that President Trump greeted and warmly embraced as a fine young man, who is, as far as I can tell, just a war criminal and a mass murderer. And he's also trying to kill Alawites, Shiites, Christians, anybody else who is not a Sunni Islamist that bends the knee to him. So we have a catastrophe in Syria, all for the purpose of expanding Israel and encircling Iran. And this particular corridor that runs from Israel and its border all the way up on the far eastern and northern side of Syria reaches to Azerbaijan, which has now become a platform for attack against Iran. It certainly was during the missile strikes. It continues to be that, and it's being used also to split Iran from Russia. So now we're talking about 40, 50,000 Russian troops on the border with Azerbaijan. We seem to think that somehow or another Russia is doing so poorly in Ukraine that it can't cope with Azerbaijan. I think we're about to get an education. That's not true. As you point out, that war is coming to a close. The difference is that in Ukraine, the Russians are moving like a giant vacuum cleaner. They're simply picking up every remaining Ukrainian soldier, and anyone that doesn't surrender is killed, because they want to be sure when they move on Kiev, and they will, and south to Odessa, that there's nothing behind them that can interrupt or disrupt their operations, taking them further west. So we have two things happening right now. They're anti-Russian in the Middle East, as well as in Ukraine. And all of this is bound up with the Greater Israel Project. And by the way, the Mossad is equally engaged, along with the MI6 and the CIA, in Ukraine, and has been almost from the beginning.
For goodness sakes.
Real quick, we had a comment here from one of our viewers that asks this question: is it true that drug cartels are being trained in Ukraine on how to use drones? Like, are they literally turning to the drug cartels now to be carrying out these operations?
Well, I don't know that they've turned to the drug cartels as much as the drug cartels have asked to come in there. And remember that Ukraine is an organized crime state, much like Mexico. Right. Everything revolves around money, human trafficking, drug trafficking. That's another reason the Russians want to shut this down. It's another reason why we should be interested in shutting the war down. I don't know how many women and children are missing from Ukraine. I don't even want to begin to guess, but I'm sure it's substantial. And then the drugs that pass through there, and we know the black market for all of the equipment that we send over there reaches all the way down into Kosovo and all the way to North Africa and back to Mexico. So, yeah, the drug cartels are in there, and they're trying to train their people how to use these first-person view hand-launched UAVs, or drones, as we call them. No doubt about it. Criminality, terrorism, corruption, all of those things go together. And Ukraine is the perfect example of it.
Yeah.
That's why we need what the Senate Appropriations Committee just approved, which is an $853 billion defense bill, because we know a lot of that is shifty money, gets stolen, gets in the wrong hands. It includes $800 million for Ukraine, even though the Pentagon didn't ask for it. The Senate just said, you're taking it. We love war. That's what we do. So, Colonel McGregor, thank you for letting us know what really happens.
Sobering as always.
Well,
Natalie, thank you, Colonel.
Natalie, just keep in mind, some of that money's never going to go to Ukraine. It's just going to be washed through the system into the Defense Department and back to the defense industries and show up as contributions to congressmen and senators. There's a reason everybody on the Hill these days, just about everybody's a multimillionaire. That's something I would pay attention to.
Well, that's why we have to work hard to be taxed to afford it. So
yeah, so we can.
But you just got to get Lee to stop talking about beef jerky. Come on now, we got to get on other topics.
Exactly.
The Colonel logged in, and we were having a discussion about beef jerky. I could talk a blue streak about it.
In our pre-show, we were talking about like low carb good snacks. Yeah, that was our pre-show.
Also, I'm a big fan of pork rinds.
Yeah, Colonel, great to see you. Now you're making me hungry. Thanks, Colonel.
Bye-bye.
All right. Coming up on the show, we're going to talk about the EU. Why did they bend the knee to President Trump? They're literally getting, it seems like, shafted in this new deal. But why did Brussels bend the knee? We're going to talk with Ralph Schulhammer about that.